FlossTube. My name is Laura and I am the Nerdy Needle. This is the fourth and last video in my series of tutorials on how I do full coverage stitching using a parking method where I leave all of my needles threaded. The first video that I made was all about how to make your stitches prettier. I came up with 3 rules that are a summary of things that I've learned from my own experience and from other fellow stitchers on FlossTube. The second video is all about stitching on the diagonal and how you do it and why you would want to do that. The third one is how to start and end your threads from the front of your fabric. The technique I'm going to show you today, you're going to have a bunch of needles that are threaded and they are going to be on needle minders, but if you're constantly flipping your work upside down to end threads, you're going to end up with those needles falling out of position and you're going to get things tangled up. So you have to be able to start and end your threads from the front. Today will be the actual description of what parking is, how you would do it based on which corner of your work that you start and how whether you're stitching rows or columns. And then I will just have you look over my shoulder as I walk you through a couple of rows of this technique. Before I get to that, I want to do a couple of shout outs. The first one is for Brian. He is Blitz Stitch. He's a fellow science nerd. He's an engineer. And he's the one who introduced me to the idea of parking, of stitching on the diagonal, of the whole issue with elongated stitches and how that affects the neatness of your work. The whole thing about coming up in unoccupied holes and going down in occupied holes. So all of that came from Brian. And so I definitely want to acknowledge his contribution to my own stitching because I've learned a huge amount from him. I'm going to link his parking tutorial in the description box. I would highly recommend that you go check it out. He does a different parking technique than I do, but he does a good explanation of it. And so I think it's definitely worth your time. And he does beautiful work. And just as everyday floss tubes are fun to watch because he does some really spectacular patterns. The other person that I want to do a shout out for is Farris. She started a FlossTube channel last fall, I believe, and she is the one FlossTube person who I make a point of watching her videos the day they come out. She always posts them on Friday and I watch them on Friday. I have learned more from Jean than I have from any other stitcher on FlossTube by a lot. She is not a full coverage stitcher. She stitches samplers, she does white work and other styles of embroidery. It actually works really well with stitching full coverage and then doing a rotation where I have samplers in there. Because what I'm finding is that samplers and full coverage are a pretty different styles of stitching. My full coverage pieces, I stitch on a frame. I stitch very algorithmically, very methodically, same way every time. Samplers, I stitch in hand. I use kind of a sewing technique for making my stitches. It's more free flowing where I kind of have to, it's like choose your own adventure. Which direction am I going to carry? Which direction am I going to travel to make, to make this figure or that one or whatever. So it's a different experience stitching samplers. And it's, if you're exclusively a full coverage stitcher, I would recommend that you give it a try. One of the things I really like about stitching samplers is because I stitch in hand, it's a lot more tactile. With full coverage, I mean, you hold your needle and you touch your threads, but the fabric, I mean, Aida is not a particularly pleasant fabric to be holding anyway, because it's kind of rough and stiff. Contrast that with stitching on linen, which is a wonderfully soft fabric to hold in your hand. So I'm really enjoying the tactile experience of stitching samplers contrasted to stitching full coverage. So those are my shout outs. Jean, I would recommend that you go watch every single video that she's done. You will learn an immense amount. And of course, I will link her in the description box below. She also has an Etsy shop and her patterns are beautiful. So go check those out, especially the white work. I've never done white work before. If you've ever wanted to try, go buy her pattern, one of her patterns on white work, and you will learn how to do that from her. She does a series of videos, and she has these phenomenal charts, and you will be able to learn how to do white work, which it's actually surprisingly easy. So for today, I'm going to explain to you how to do parking based on which corner of your work that you start in, whether you're stitching rows or columns. So I will go through all of that. And then I'm going to show you I'll stitch a couple of rows and have you look over my shoulder, and I'll talk you through how I do this. A couple of pointers. I tried zooming in more as I was testing out how to video myself stitching. It caused some weird color distortions and things just started looking funny. So it's zoomed in a little bit, but not a ton. I would recommend that you don't forget that if you're watching on your phone or a tablet, you can zoom in easily, and that will be a useful thing to do on several places. The other thing is the needle minder that I use is this thing. It's called the Needle Park Avenue. This is what's going to hold all of your needles with your parked threads in them. And the thing that took me a while to figure out, and once I figured this out, everything kind of clicked, was how to put my needles in this thing. So it's just a piece of plastic with a magnet, and it's the fuzzy side of Velcro that's on the top. So it's really easy if you just kind of gently place your needles in there. That's not what you want to do. You want to really dig that needle and feel the plastic scraping the tip of your needle as you seat it firmly. So that's the key. Once I realized that really digging that needle in and making sure that it's seated firmly, that was the key. Once I figured that out, I no longer had tangles. I've stitched several hours today and I've had 0 tangles. So that's the key, and I wanted to emphasize that before I transition over to the rest of the video, because it was kind of like a light bulb moment. Once I figured this out, everything started working beautifully. So the rest of the video today is just a description of how to do this, and then have you watch over my shoulder as I stitch away. I hope you find this helpful. The last thing that you need to determine before you can use the parking method is to figure out where you're going to park your thread, which hole of a stitch you're going to park your thread in. That's going to be determined by which corner you start and how you cross your X. So we've been through this before. If you want to stitch in rows top to bottom, this is what I'm going to be demonstrating because this is how I stitch. If you have a top left start and you're stitching in rows, the way that you're going to make your X is you're going to make the green leg first and then the red leg second. The reason that you're doing this is because with a top left corner start stitching in rows, this is going to ensure that you're not going to elongate your stitches and that you're going to be coming up in unoccupied holes and going down in occupied holes. Those two things are key to making prettier, more regular stitches, and that will result in a prettier end result in your project. So these things will change based on which corner you want to start. All right, so if this is how we're stitching, so here's my X, you always park in the place where you bring up your needle first to make an X. So your parking corner, because the green leg is first, it's going to be the bottom left corner. If you are starting top right and you're stitching rows, then the red leg is going to be first, and so you're going to park in the bottom right corner. If you want to go bottom to top rows, Then your parking corner, because the green leg will be first, the parking corner is going to be the upper right corner. If you want to do a bottom right start and do rows, then the upper left corner is going to be your parking spot. For columns, going top to bottom, since the green leg is first, where you bring up your needle, which is the upper right, that's where you're going to park. For a top right start, because the red leg is first, your parking location is the upper left. And then finally, for columns bottom to top, the red leg is first, so where you bring up your needle to make that stitch is going to be the bottom right corner. And finally, for the bottom right start for columns, the green leg is first, so your parking location is going to be the bottom left. So what this means is, if this is how you're stitching, so if you are a column stitcher and you want to start in the bottom right corner, you're always going to cross your X's going this direction. And so when you have a color thread that you don't need for the next stitch, but you're going to need later on, you're going to bring that color up in the bottom left corner of the stitch that color will go into, and you're going to park it temporarily there until you need it. So instead of ending a thread, you park your thread, but the key thing here is that you need to park those in the correct location depending on how you're stitching. So which corner you started and how you're crossing your X's. I'm going to show you what the strategy is for stitching with the parking method if you're stitching in rows. The same thing applies to stitching in columns. I've never done that, but you're going to need to make a few adjustments, but I don't think it's all that different than what I'm going to describe. So there are 3 categories of parked threads. The first one is what I'm going to call the actively parked threads. Those are left on a needle. Then we've got threads that are parked for later. Those are also left on the needle. And then threads that will only be used on the next diagonal. That's the one where I pull the needle off and I drape those threads over the back of my scroll frame. So I'm going to attempt to color code this while trying to figure out my chart. This is a chart to nothing. This is just gibberish. I got into my pattern maker app on my laptop and just clicked on a bunch of symbols. I made this pretty darn confetti heavy, so it's going to be a bit of a challenge. We'll see how I do with managing this many colors. All right, so we're going to assume that these 2 diagonals have already been stitched and that I don't have any current parked threads. So I stitch left to right, top to bottom. So I'm going to stitch this whale color, and then I look in that row. If there's any more whales, I will stitch them in that row, but there aren't any. So I'm going to drop down, and there is a whale on the next row down. So I'm going to park my thread in the bottom left corner. It's bottom left because I'm stitching left to right, top to bottom. That's always where I park. If you have a different corner start, then you may or may not need to park in a different corner. Okay, so moving on to this up arrow business. So I'll stitch that one and that one. And there's one in the next row, so I will park there. These are both active parked threads because it's the next row. So these are going to go on my needle minder that is for the next, that is preparing me for the next row. I got this down arrow, I'll stitch that, and then look for another one of those down arrows. I'm not seeing one. And there's a good chance I'm going to miss it because this is so busy. But let's say that, oh, here's one. There's one right there. So let's say that I'm going to park there, but because this is on the next diagonal over, what I'm going to do is park it for my next diagonal. So I'll park in my bottom left corner, pull that needle off, and drape that thread over the back of my scroll frame, and I'm not going to touch it again until I'm stitching that diagonal. Okay, so I'll stitch that little quarter circle business. So there isn't one of those on the next row, but there is one down here. So that gets the later park. It works the same way. I'm still going to park my needle in the bottom left corner, but instead of putting this needle and thread on my active needle minders, these will get parked down at the bottom of my scroll frame, along with all of my other threads that are sitting there from my previous diagonal. So this guy is kind of placed out of the way for now, until I get to it. Okay, I've got my triangle, so I'll get those solid triangles. I'm in the same situation with that solid triangle, so this is going to be parked for later. So leave the needle on, but put it down below by the bottom of the scroll frame. This, I have no idea what this thing is. Get those, and then same deal as before. This is going to get parked for later. So leave the needle on, but park it down at the bottom of your scroll frame. We've got this A, lowercase a. I really did an excellent job making this like incredibly confetti heavy, didn't I? So that, there's one of those right here. So this one, I'll bring up my thread, pull the needle, and this will be draped across the back of my scroll frame for the next diagonal. Now we've got this little down arrow. So there is one in the next row. So that means because it's just the next row, that will be actively parked. So the only difference between the active park and the later park is the active park goes straight onto my needle minder in order so that it's ready for this next row. For later parks, they're sitting down at the bottom of my scroll frame, kind of out of the way until I need them. We've got this wavy thing. There's a wavy thing down there, so that gets a later park down at the bottom. So now I've hit my first parked thread from the previous row. So all I have to do, because there's already a parked thread there and it's on the needle, all I have to do is grab that needle and put in the stitch. I don't have to thread that needle because it's already there waiting for me. So that's the whale. I don't see any more whales until way down here. Let's just pretend there's no more and that whale thread got ended. We've got the star. There's a star, so that will get parked for later, down at the bottom of my frame. We've got this caret symbol. There's two of those, and this will also get parked for later. In general, I don't have this happen very often where I have more waiting for later parked threads as opposed to for the next row. Most of my parked threads are for the next row, and this type of thing is pretty sporadic in every full coverage piece I've stitched so far. I haven't done like uber crazy confetti, so I don't know, maybe that'll be a little bit different, but this was basically just randomly clicking on symbols, and so there's no rhyme or reason to how this is put together. So now we've got the radioactive symbol, and we'll park that down here. So that'll be active for the next row. Then we've got the snow. We'll park that in the next row. And then this one, I already have a thread park there on a needle. So all I have to do is stitch that one and park here. Now, one of the things that I do as I'm setting up my threads for the next row to park is, as I'm looking here, I know that this thread I just used in the previous row. I just used it there. So when I see that I've parked this here, I already know that there's a thread there because I can see it on my fabric. So I will actually grab this thread that was down at the bottom of my scroll frame, and I will now put it in amongst my active threads. So that gets turned into an active thread. Same thing with this one when I get to it. So I'll be stitching across. I'll see this one's there, so it goes in with the active thread group. And this one was also, so it's getting pulled up from that bottom later parking lot. It gets pulled up and gets put in the active. So same thing with this one. As I'm going across and I see those later parked threads, they get pulled and put in the active pile. So that is how you go through and go systematically left to right, top to bottom, parking your threads. I will show you this in actuality, and I think that these two things together will make more sense when you actually see me doing it. So this is how I do my needle parking method. I use a Millennium frame. They're amazing. If you get a chance to buy one, I would strongly recommend that you do so. They're worth every penny, and it's worth the wait too. So starting at the top, looking at the tools that I use, I have my Snag Nabbit. This is a great little tool for when I bring a little bit of lint or fuzz up from the back of my fabric. Usually it just catches on my needle and my thread, and it just pops up as a bit of fuzz. This thing is great for pushing it to the back of the fabric. I have a needle minder that's more like a pin cushion with lots of needles ready to go. The key to needle parking is you need lots and lots of needles. I have my Swiss Army knife tweezers. I use these to help cut off my waist knots. I use the Swiss Army knife tweezers because they're really super lightweight, and I don't like putting lots of weight on my fabric because I don't want it to potentially stretch. I have a Loran needle threader. I like these because it's got a bit of iron in it, so it will stick to a needle minder. It's the only one that I've found that does stick to a needle minder. I have a laying tool that I use more to flip threads than to actually lay threads. I have a trolley needle. This is what I use as my laying tool. What this is for is if you stitch with one or more thread, or with more than one thread, so 2 or more threads, then you run the threads over the top of this as it's entering the fabric, and that causes the strands to lay parallel to each other, and it gives you fuller stitches. It's called a trolley needle. I'm left-handed, so this goes on my non-dominant hand. I have embroidery scissors. I have my damp sponge for straightening my floss. I have 2 of these needle minders. They're called Needle Park Avenue. They come with a super strong rare earth magnet, 2 of them on the back. So once you put this on, they do not move. And this is kind of the key to one of the keys to my parking technique with needles. It's just a piece of stiffer plastic with the fuzzy side of Velcro stuck to it. And that's what you park your needles in. My threads, I organize them on just cards. Notice that I braid my tails. This is another trick I picked up a couple of years ago from FlossTube. This keeps my tails from getting all tangled. I have a Paco needle organizer for all of my threaded needles. Now you see what I mean by lots and lots of needles. So you want to buy your needles in bulk. I think I bought like 100 bow ends or something like that on bulk, I think on eBay maybe. And those are all my tools. I have my iPad is on the back of my stand. I have a little box for my thread clippings, my orts. And yeah, those are the tools that I use. So I have 3 categories of threads. First of all, I roll my scroll bars kind of funny this way, so over the back and then reverse at the bottom. I roll it this way at the bottom because it gives me a tool tray, and it also protects any stitches. If I had stitches under here, it would be the wrong side out, so they wouldn't get damaged. If I do get stitches, if I do have enough stitches that it's down onto my scroll bars, I will use a grime guard on both sides. So I roll under at the bottom, roll over at the top. The reason I roll over at the top is because of my parked threads. These are the threads, notice they're not on needles. So these are my parked threads that I've set aside for my next diagonal down. So once I pull the needle off of these and set them back behind, I'm not going to deal with these until I'm all the way down this diagonal and I start on the next one. And that's why I rolled the scroll bar this way. I found that when I rolled it the other way, shorter parked threads would just flop back into my work, and that was kind of annoying. So this way they just stay out of the way and it works well. My second category of parked threads are clipped together. All of these threads right here, these are the ones that I parked from my previous diagonal. So when I was stitching right here, all of these threads, as I was parking them, they were up at the top, right up here. And when I got all the way down to the bottom of that last diagonal, I just took all of these threads at the top, pulled them down at the bottom. I put a hair clip on them to put a bit of weight on it. There's a needle tucked behind there to hang on to those so they're not going to go flopping all over on me. So those are out of the way. And I will just, when I get to a parked thread, when I see that there's one in the row that I'm going to stitch, I just pull it out of this clump. These are my active threads that are set up and ready to go for my next row. So this is basically kind of flopped down like that is how my last row finished. So next thing I'm going to do is zoom you in and show you how I do a couple of rows of parking while leaving all my threads on needles. So I'm going to stitch a couple of rows and show you how I do my needle parking. So there's, the order of these threads is very specific. The bottommost thread corresponds to the leftmost color and the topmost thread is the rightmost color. So all of these got layered in order as I stitched the previous row. Now I'm going to flip all of these threads upside down because currently my first thread, the one that I'm going to want to stitch with first, is at the bottom. I want it at the top. So I'm just going to grab and use my laying tool to grab all of these threads, make sure that I'm not taking threads that are down at the bottom, and I'm just going to flip them all. And it doesn't need to be particularly neat. Just flip them up like that. Now you want to make sure that your needles, so as I'm kind of sorting out these threads, I'm looking to see, are my needles all seated pretty solidly in my needle minder. Make sure that I don't have like one thread hooked onto another needle. That looks fine. It doesn't matter if like the threads themselves, if they're all clumped together, that doesn't matter. It's totally fine. All right, so I stitch two-handed. My trolley needle goes on my non-dominant hand. And so my left hand is down below. So I grab my first needle. I stitch off my iPad. Usually as I showed you, my iPad is behind, but the glare is terrible with the way I've got my light, so it's in my lap. So, but I'll make it work. It's a little bit awkward because my phone is in the way. But I just recorded myself doing this, and you would have been looking at my head for about 3/4 of the time. And that's not a particularly good view. So, gonna redo this. All right, so here's my first 2 stitches. And so this color right now is, I'm parking it in the bottom left corner, so where I would make, if I was going to make the stitch, this is where I would bring my needle up. So I just pull up my thread, and this gets parked on my Park Avenue needle minder at the bottom. So I'm going to go in order from bottom to top as I go left to right. And I need 2 of these. So if you decide to try a laying tool, like my Trolley Needle, they're great. As you can see, they take next to no extra time, or actually really no extra time. They make your stitches a little bit fuller. So if you do use a Trolley Needle or a laying tool, you have to use it for the entire project, because otherwise you're going to see a subtle difference between the stitches that had the laying tool on them and the ones that didn't. And basically what it does is the threads run over the top of the little spike, and it makes them lay parallel, which makes for neater stitches. So here's my light blue, and this goes. So I have a waist knot there. So that's what the tweezers are for. And just grab that knot and snip right at the fabric. And then there's a bit of fuzz that came up. What did I do? My iPad just unthreaded that stupid thread. How annoying. My iPads have magnets in them, you've probably noticed if you have one, and it just unthreaded, just caught this needle. Little poopy head. So that is a reminder that if you have pets, you need to make sure that every time you finish a stitching session that you run a magnet around your chair and everything around there, because it's really easy to lose needles because you're using so many of them. And you know, if you manage to drop one, your pet's gonna get into it. All right, so you can see that there's a bit of fuzz that came through from that snipped off waist knot. So 2 ways I solve that. One is I just take my needle and I scratch the back of the fabric to just kind of pull that away. You can kind of hear it and see it just popped out. The other way to do it is with the snag nabbit. This is about as short of a thread that I will bother parking. Any shorter than this, it doesn't reach very well onto the needle minder, and then it starts catching and whatever. So I'm less frugal with my thread when I stitch this style than like with my sampler work, but not by a whole lot. My stupid PDF reader. I use Goodreader, which has been awesome. Until like today, it's just started crashing on me like every half hour or so. I did a restart on my iPad. I wonder if I just need to dump it and re-download it. Pain. I'll need to make sure that everything I have saved in it is in the cloud before I do that. So I have a waist knot that, nope, it's not on the way. I'll deal with that later then. I'm right here. So again, bottom left corner. So when you grab the, when you go for your next needle, you want to grab the needle, not the thread. If you start pulling on the threads, you're just, you'll end up with a mess really quickly. So I got one of those. And so another thing that I do sometimes, I'm just doing it right now, is this color that I just did is actually the same as that color. So I'm running 2 needles with the same color, which is totally fine. My guess is that one of these threads was a parked thread from a previous diagonal, and so I just picked it up and started stitching. So let's say that I have 2 needles running the same color and I have a stretch of 10 stitches. I'll just split it in half between them. So I'll stitch 5 with one needle, 5 with the other. And then, you know, I'll just run both of them until they run out, and then see if I want to keep doing that or just continue on with one needle. So it really doesn't matter because I'm not having to thread needles. And picking up another needle is no big deal. So that's a long story for why I'm just going to complete this stitch, even though on my chart I saw that I need, over on this side, there's more this color again, but there's the thread for it, so I don't need to use this side. So that's a good way of avoiding carrying threads longer distances. You can just run multiple needles with the same color. So what else can I tell you about this method? It's a very, this is very algorithmic stitching. When I first pondered, I stared at that, if you've seen my first FlossTube where I did my finishes, I showed my meadow full coverage piece. That one I stared at for at least a year before I worked up the courage to do it. And honestly, in a lot of ways, this is easier stitching than, say, stitching a sampler. It's just bigger. That's the only difference. It's just going to take longer. But as far as difficulty, of course, I've done a bajillion of this type of stitching and less so of samplers, but it's just a very, very straightforward way of stitching. You don't have to use a whole lot of brain power. And if you have a stressful, high-intensity job like I do, I'm a high school teacher, the last thing on earth you want to do after a hard day of teaching is come home and do a whole lot of heavy-duty thinking. And so having a craft like this, where you can make something pretty, but you can almost just put yourself on autopilot, and kind of meditate while you stitch. Whereas with the sampler, you have to think a little bit more. Which direction do I want to go? I mean, it's basically cross-country stitching when you stitch samplers. So it's just a different different style of thinking, I think. I'm thinking a lot, I guess. It's a different, it's just a different style, and I'm finding that I really like stitching on the two different styles in combination. So in my rotations, I'm working on a couple of samplers. Or actually one is white work. Well, one is a red work unicolor sampler, and then the other one is a traditional, it's a reproduction sampler, and then I have a white work. So I've got basically 3 sampler-ish type of things going in my rotation, and then I always have a full coverage. And the full coverage is kind of like my mac and cheese, or it's my comfort food. It's my comfort stitching. It's the one that I feel just the most relaxed and comfortable with, and it's kind of my put on my pajamas and do full coverage. I got too busy talking and I forgot that I need to put this stitch, so I'll pick that up when on my next row across, so I'll have to remember that. And you can kind of tell how distracted I was by how straight my diagonals are. You can see that there's a little jog in it right there, and that one I actually did on purpose, but like I was talking on the phone, and then now I'm talking to you guys. Actually, that was when my head was in the way. So, but it doesn't matter because it's all going to get stitched in the end. But it's kind of funny looking back. It's like, well, somebody was talking to me there, and I just kept going. All right, so I need to pick up that stitch still and cross this off of my iPad. All right, so I need to flip my threads. So again, I'm looking to see, I don't want to grab these guys. So that's what the laying tool is good for. You could use a chopstick. I would not use a pencil because the graphite, you don't want to get graphite anywhere near your stitching. So this is what I mean about threads kind of hooking around another needle. It's just picking those out, and that's really the only time that I think the worst they ever do to each other is they, like, one needle will unthread another needle, which is kind of mean, but it's not a big deal. All right, so those are all flipped. Now notice how I orient my needles. Because I use my non-dominant right hand at the top of my fabric, I always have my needles so that the back end of the needle where I want to grab it is always pointed towards the right. So even over here, it's like that, and then over here, it's like that. So I'm not like having to rotate my hand around. For a long time, like these guys, because I was thinking symmetrical. That makes sense. And so every time I get over here, I'd have to like do a weird movement, and then I was like, why am I doing this? All right, so I need 4 of those. I'm listening, my fridge is making a weird noise. It does that. All right. So, right. Oh, no, one over. Yeah. All right. Oh, that's a new color. I was like, where's that thread? So again, this needle has to come first, so I'm going to switch places with that. So when I go to flip, they're going to be in order. I need a new color, which is, oh, let me look to see. Nope, I don't have it on the needle thing. It's that stupid ice maker again. It just makes this really annoying sound, and then I have to practically climb inside the freezer and try to unjam it. It's a pain. All right, back to stitching. So here's my thread. I've got my damp sponge, and I just run my thread through it. And look how straight that thread becomes. By the time I'm done threading this needle, it'll be dry. And this, I learned this from Farris. I've been doing this for maybe a couple of months. I hardly ever get slip knots on the back of my work anymore. And it's because my thread is straight. So this is, I used Thread Heaven for a while, and then Thread Magic, and this is, I will never use that stuff again for regular stitching. There's no point to it. This is far superior. So this is a fresh thread, so I'm using the loop method. And so now if I would have been thinking a little bit, I would have noticed that I had parked my previous diagonal. I had parked the thread in the wrong spot. I missed by 1 square, because that thread is the one that I just put in. And of course, I only need 3 stitches of this light blue. It's a very pretty light blue, but I only need 3 stitches. Yay. So the thread that I have, I'm just going to end it. I'm so glad I wasted that, that loop start. Oh well, it doesn't take much time to start it again if I need to somewhere else. So that gets snipped and then placed on my needle minder. So that was the first place I looked. Where did that come from? That was the first place I looked before I pulled a thread off of my thread cards. So I'm gonna the plot thickens. So this parked thread was actually from above. So I was using this up here somewhere, and then I think up here somewhere, and then I missed by one row, by 1 square, I missed parking this. So that's why this got to be a little bit screwed up, but no harm, no foul, as they say. It doesn't matter, because I'm just gonna straighten this thing a little bit. It's all good, but that's the nice thing about the waste knot method, is that you know, it really doesn't matter that I lost the loop start on that thread, because I'll just start it with a waist knot where I need it next, and it doesn't take any more time to do a waist knot than it does to do the loop start. So it's because it's just so simple to do either one. It doesn't matter. And there is a waist knot. I forgot to snip this. I wonder if the video is going to pick up that noise from my freezer. Kind of sounds like a time bomb about to go off. I'm really enjoying stitching this. It's you know, architectural as opposed to that field of flowers that was my last full coverage piece. So it's a very different thing, but I'm really enjoying it. I got a 6 and one below it. This is a Vervaco Kit. If you've never tried one of their kits, it's a Belgian company. I got it from the stitchery.com, and I think I have well, 3 smalls and 3 kind of smallish, bigger than smalls but not very big kits from them. Those were the first things that I stitched when I got back into cross stitch about 4 or 5 years ago. But they make really, really nice kits. I'm really just really pretty colors, and I mean, this is just turning out beautifully. I mean, the picture they provided does not even remotely do this pattern justice. It's really just quite stunning. The red sampler, if you've seen, you can see a red sampler on the introduction to my videos. That's the Chlorami letter chaos. That's also a Belgian maker. I guess the Belgians have quite the embroidery tradition. All right, so let's see if I can land this in the right spot. So one of the issues I'm having is because I'm looking down at my lap and then look back at the my stitching. I have switched so many colors that I'm not even sure what color I'm looking for. And there's a needle in my left hand under my fabric, but I don't want to stick my head under my scroll frame. So how do I figure out what color I currently have in my hand? Well, what I do is I just tug on the thread just a little bit, and that causes the thread on the top to dimple just enough so you can see it. And that tells you which color you have in your hand, because you'd be surprised how many times I'll do a stitch and then I'll think, what color did I just do? So this is the trick for getting that. And is this going to be right? No. I just did. Two, and then there's one between it. Oops. Yeah. Okay, so this one, because it's 2 rows down, it's not going to go in my active threads. It's going to go down below. And continue on. Same deal. It was like, what color was that? 3 in the front. So once my thread gets short, I stop using the trolley needle just because it's awkward to get it in there. And what it really does is it takes the twist out of your two strands. And when your thread is short enough, you know, anything shorter than that, I don't think it really twists very much anymore when it's that short. And 2 over, yeah. Oh, I forgot that color up above. I forgot that stitch I dropped up there, up here. And here's an example of making sure I do a thread direction change. So I'm going into the top hole and not the bottom one, to avoid elongating stitches. Anytime you can avoid doing that, it's a good thing. Can't always, but a lot of times you can. So you'll see that my waist knots, I tend to, with few exceptions, place them in the path of the current diagonal. And I do that just because I like having my image be nice and clean with only my working threads on top and not a bunch of little knots. Now this thread I purposely put below because I saw that there was this lighter color, and it's extremely nitpicky. I mean, extremely nitpicky to do this, but I didn't want to carry this dark of a color under a lighter color because of the potential for that carried thread. Because remember that when I put that waist knot in, all of this stitching wasn't here. So that carried thread from where I ended to the waist knot is up against the back of the fabric. And so out of an abundance of caution, I don't want to have that dark color up against that light color. I just remembered, I honestly wasn't looking very far. I just saw, and I had memorized the symbol for that lighter color. And I thought, as soon as I saw a string of those, I was like, oh, there might be a lighter patch of color here. I'm not going to risk carrying a dark thread that's going to get covered by lighter threads. So I put my waist knot purposely in the path of its own color. So that's why it's not under the diagonal. So that's a long explanation, but that's why I did that. I'm done with this thread, so come up, and that goes for the next diagonal. So that's 2 rows with some ranting about my refrigerator thrown in. Hey, it stopped making that noise. That's nice. And a bunch of stitching to go with it. Please write questions, comments. I really appreciate everything that folks have said. I hope that you find at least some of this useful. And I'm happy to answer questions or even make other videos if there's significant things that I haven't explained fully. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good night.